Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to start this regulatory pulse with Mark. Mark, you are the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector at ISED. AI in 25 minutes, we'll do our best, right? So let's start maybe with the federal budget. $2.4 billion announced recently, covering a lot of sectors. Do you have any scoops on maybe or additional details or how fast this is going to be implemented and perhaps where ISED sits in this implementation scheme?
Well, thanks so much, Naïm, and thanks to the team here for the kind invitation to be part of this first forum. So yeah, it was an exciting day, whatever it was, 4 Sundays ago, when the Prime Minister made the announcement around the $2.4 billion for AI in Montreal. It breaks down in kind of a number of component parts, and it's probably really quickly worth just saying it builds on a long-standing kind of commitment to AI as a sector and its continued deployment in Canada that is sort of builds on decades worth of support for fundamental science, which is really what has helped position Canada as a leader in the field initially. And so the biggest share of it is really the $2 billion for compute. This is really aimed in kind of 2 buckets. One is an initial kind of access to compute for companies and researchers kind of working on models that are going to require significantly larger compute capacity than often what is provided either through the existing academic networks or through private sector access. That looks in the short term like chips access, as well as some of the kind of broader kind of data construction and kind of infrastructure that's required. But the larger play within it is the development of sovereign compute capacity that will allow Canada, even in the face of some tricky geopolitical issues, to have dedicated and sovereign access that allow ourselves to remain security of supply. The smaller buckets, though, are not less important. They're actually kind of interesting. So $300 million for various forms of AI adoption, $200 million of which goes to the regional development agencies, and $100 million of which goes to the National Research Council for its Industrial Research Assistance Program, or NRC-IRAP. That'll be interesting. NRC-IRAP obviously at the forefront of kind of technology leading companies with a real incentive to trying to push AI into the adoption around those NRC-IRAP projects. And then the RDAs with some very particular focus on sectors. So looking at AI's adoption into clean tech, into services, into a number of the kind of areas of comparative advantage for the country. $50 million to our friends at Employment and Social Development Canada to work on some of the skills transitions that are going to be required as a function of the AI revolution. Cultural industries was flagged in the budget. Some, I think, saw that as sort of a function of a transition away from current industrial practices. I think there's a good read of that. That's actually the opposite. This is the adoption of AI in creative industries, in part to allow for themselves to have a continued function. And then $50 million for the creation of a Canadian Artificial Intelligence Safety Institute. I should note all of these files, other than the RDA ones, are led out of ISED, and so we're hard at work. We have very short kind of timelines on the Safety Institute, so I'm under instruction to have kind of a good understanding of that project before the summer. We'll be at the Korean AI Safety Summit in 2 weeks to try and continue to position Canada geopolitically to be able to both cooperate and engage with our colleagues at the US AI Safety Institute, run out of NIST, and then out of the UK AI Institute, which is run out of DSIT. So all that to say is I think we're covering the waterfront in the 2.4 on kind of the adoption side, the risk side, the safety side, the dual use side, the national security side. And then I should have noted a very small proportion of money for the new AI and Data Commissioner that will come as a function of the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I know from speaking with different clients that sometimes people that they want to hire, the first question they ask is, do you have AI compute, right? So this is a really important question. Turning to Bill C-27, which you may have heard about, right? I know that you're very closely involved with everything relating to Bill C-27, including at 11 o'clock today, continuing with committee hearings. Obviously, Bill C-27 has privacy and AI components. Let's focus on AI here, but I would love to hear also a bit on data portability, which I know is important for people in this room. Can you tell us a little bit what's the latest to note and where do you see things? And also maybe what's not there yet, specifically regulations and the type of approach that you're thinking about in terms of regulations?
Yeah, that's a helpful seg. So obviously C-27, the Digital Charter Implementation Act, 2023, has been on the books since June of 2023. Parliament's continued its consideration of it, and it now sits before the Industry Committee of Parliament. We'll resume clause by clause in an hour and a half, where I am hopeful that we will make more progress today than we did on Wednesday last week, where we got through 0 amendments. So, the bill, particularly the Artificial and Data Act, AIDA is a structure essentially for allowing the government to be able to begin the process of regulating high-impact AI systems. And it's evolved considerably since its tabling, and it's evolved over the course of its consideration before Parliament. The minister has made clear that he's comfortable and open to the possibility of defining high-impact AI systems with a set of examples in the Act itself, and we have a proposed amendment that we'll come to as we get through clause by clause that will identify those high-impact AI systems that include things like education and things like access to employment, health. It also has some provisions related to general purpose systems, which obviously have emerged as a particularly considered zone of potential risk. We intend to pursue the regulations on a system-by-system basis. So we do not intend to have overarching singular regulations for all high-impact AI systems. We imagine we'll have regulations that actually speak to the unique kind of positions of the high-impact AI system category in its entirety. And we'll obviously need to be very sensitive in some of those categories because it's aimed to be a law of general application. It's meant to actually get at the overarching algorithm and model behind the system, and also be gradated across the value chain. So one of the key kind of determinations and dimensions that's kind of emerged over the course of the Act was our work on the voluntary code for generative AI from industry. And that really gave us a really strong perspective about needing to differentiate between the role that a developer plays versus a deployer in a B2B model versus a deployer in a B2C model, and then some of the kind of actual in-market potential kind of risks and flags that need to be put out when you're actually potentially opening up a model to the general public. So we're nowhere near AIDA committee yet. We are still very much in the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. There are AI provisions, as you noted, in that act. So there is a requirement to flag for individual Canadian citizens when they're getting requests for their personal information to be treated by an automated decision-making system. And you have an obligation to let them know that they're interacting with an ADS. They also have a right to ask what personal information they provided to that ADS, and not how that was factored into the decision, but which pieces of personal information factored into the automated decision. And then on data portability, as you noted, there's an overarching right, which allows people to be able to request the movement of their personal information from one service provider to another, subject to a data mobility framework. And we believe that data mobility framework is the system that will lay out from a bunch of regulators, but the first obviously is in financial services, where we imagine that open banking will be the first ideal usage case for data portability.
Thank you, Mark. So you're with ISED, and we have other regulatory agencies in the room here, Bank of Canada, Finance Canada, FSRO, and OSC, among others. It's always helpful, I think, for businesses in general and financial institutions in particular to understand the role of each of the regulatory agencies. So I'm curious as to the extent to which you may speak among each other, right, in terms of regulatory agencies, what you see as your role, and what may be the role of others. If you can talk to us a little bit about that. Thank you.
So I'll be super nerdy for a minute, and then I'll try and get quite practical. The nerdy point I'll make is when the digital charter was launched, we launched the white paper on the future of the private sector privacy law. And at the back of that, there's essentially a kind of structural framework of how we kind of imagine the relationships between the various types of regulations that impact the digital sector. And it looks at kind of the update of marketplace framework laws as sort of the laws of general application that provide the foundation layer for kind of regulation of digital and data. And that includes competition and privacy and AI, but even things like bankruptcy and insolvency, where we need to think about the valuation of data and personal information assets in a troubled financial context. We then imagine a layer around sector-specific or activity-based regulation, and I say activity-based quite purposefully because I think there was a time in which we imagined that that layer was all about sectors, and sectors were super clear, and all you needed to do was have good regulations for each one of the kind of core sectors that would rely on personal information or data. So have one for transport, have one for financial services. But actually, as we've seen, the kind of actors that are playing in a number of these spaces are, well, what's a transport company? What's a financial services company? I think we need to get to the activity, which is like who's doing lending, because that's actually quite different from necessarily who would be covered by the Bank Act. And so we imagine a layer in which that activity picks up to a much greater level of granularity and specificity for the sector itself. And then on top of that, you have standard certifications, codes, data trusts, all sorts of kind of voluntary, potentially quasi-voluntary mechanisms that industry themselves can take on that can actually lay out what good business is and what good practice is, and sometimes actually have those acknowledged by the regulator, which we imagine in the CPPA context a lot. And then on top of that, you have kind of norms, ethics, and global trade rules, which are at a much, much higher level, like, do no harm, or, data free flow without impediment. And so that's kind of the generalized structure. We're now kind of building that out. So obviously we recognize a number of particularly sector-specific and activity-based regulators, in particularly financial services, are well ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about artificial intelligence, as well as some of the implications for the prudential kind of risks that are associated with both use of data and AI. And so the goal is not to triple regulate or to regulate in ways that are at odds, but actually to have a coherent and cohesive approach. And so there's good work underway between our teams. We're very tied up with our colleagues at the Department of Finance to try and make sure that we're kind of thinking through where are those crosswalks, and ideally recognizing where sectors or activities do require an additional layer. My traditional use case is autonomous vehicles, where it's clear that personal information and AI needs to be regulated at both the level of the personal information you're putting into your vehicle and at the level of the algorithm. But I don't think any of us want to get into an autonomous vehicle purely on the basis of whether or not the algorithm was good and whether the personal information was safe, but actually whether or not the vehicle was safe. And so I think there is a layer for activity-based or kind of sector-specific regulations, but them to work coherently, which is why the AI Act actually prescribes that they'll work closely with sector regulators.
Thank you very much, Mark. There's a lot to think about. At the same time, things have to happen internally, within businesses. And I know that there have been different calls to, perhaps, the fact that there's the EU AI Act. Quebec, Alberta have announced that they may be going with their own provincial, AI acts at some point, etc. So bringing it down to what's the best way to implement things, right? And thinking about interoperability and harmonization. Can you tell us a little bit, as you're working through IDA, in terms of how you see that perhaps other laws or maybe even standards could be used, because people have to continue to implement AI systems as the law is continuing to evolve?
Totally. So I think we're obviously in good contact and vigilantly watching what is emerging out of other jurisdictions and what's happening at provincial and territorial tables. Obviously, I think our goal is to ensure that we end up with as much ease of doing business in AI as possible, while recognizing the unique kind of obligations we want to make sure are present within the Canadian ecosystem, such that we're not adopting the lowest common denominator regulatory approach just because it's the common one. And we've had lessons in other kind of approaches where we've been able to learn a lot. So on the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, there was a ton of kind of, work that we could improve on from GDPR to be able to actually pick up where some of their potential failures or mistakes had been made, and I think that's been useful. And so our goal is interoperability. The EU AI Act is obviously the most prescriptive and most comprehensive approach to date. And I think what we've done in IEDA is largely consistent, including even at definitional level and certainly how we're kind of working things through. Obviously a slightly different approach because the EC has a capacity to be able to regulate at a broad level in a way that the Canadian Federation is harder to kind of accomplish. And the EU loves to do it in ledge, and we generally don't like to do it in ledge because doing it in legislation actually significantly hinders your agility and your mobility as the technology emerges. And so our goal is to do it in reg, which means we do end up in some of these distinctions where they've set out very clearly who's in and who's out of high impact AI systems and legislation, whereas we've set out the broad classes and we will scope in and scope out when we get to the regs. And then standards will play a huge role. I mean, so obviously the approach taken from our US counterparts in the executive order from the Biden administration, we are working closely with our colleagues, both at the UAI Safety Institute, the US AI Safety Institute, but also at NIST, to ensure the work that gets done on red teaming and the work that gets done on watermarking are things that we can build on as we look at transparency and overall risk management obligations that will flow from the regulatory structures. So our goal is to try and ensure, and I think the kind of watchword for industry is, this is generally consistent, and these are all things that ideally you'd start to think about now as to having to need to be implementable, including the standards that already exist.
Thank you very much. Governance and enforcement, if you will allow me. It is an evolving regulatory environment, as we were talking about just now. And, I'm mindful that IDA is not meant to solve everything, right? At the same time, what would you, if you have any perhaps recommendations or thoughts, because you are so much into this, right, for businesses who are trying to think about governance and how they can expect enforcement?
Yeah, I'll say two things maybe about enforcement. So one is the punishment of my job, but also the opportunity of my job is that I get to be responsible for stewarding the minister's overall collection of marketplace frameworks, which means that I have the capacity to look across incorporation, competition, privacy, data protection, artificial intelligence, intellectual property, bankruptcy and insolvency, foreign investment review, telecommunications and internet policies, and look at that suite of overall statutory and regulatory instruments and try and think about how best to ensure that we're actually kind of well positioned for a data and digitally driven economy, which means that unlike what sometimes happens in the EC in the kind of competition between commissioners, where everyone wants to sort of have their own take on the flavor of the week, we actually can use the right instrument for the right task, which means that we actually can ensure that competition is for competition purposes and it's not trying to do privacy's job, and that privacy can do what privacy is supposed to do. So one early thing I'd say about enforcement is like AI and IDA is not the only thing that's going to come to bear on data and digitally driven industrial activity in the forthcoming years. There's already existing statutes, many of which touch on the core fundamental inputs for AI. So data, how you're actually working in the competitive marketplace, all of those sorts of factors. The second is, we were very purposeful in how we structured the AI and Data Commissioner, because I think there's a series of models out there as to what effective enforcement looks like. I think we've become overly kind of focused, I'd say, in some ways in the Canadian ecosystem about one model, which is an agent of parliament model, which is what exists in the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. That's actually a relative irregularity and one that arguably is a function of history more so than it is a function of design, because it was originally not supposed to be an agent of parliament for private sector oversight. It was meant to be an agent of parliament for government oversight, which makes a ton of sense that you'd have an independent body appointed by all parts of the House to oversee the government itself as a watchdog. having a watchdog not report or have kind of any form of ministerial accountability for private sector enforcement is actually an odd model, which is why we've opted for a more internal model. The other was our goal in the early years, should IEDA pass in this parliament, the intent is to try and make sure that we actually get to good regulations. And unfortunately, the more independent you are as an enforcement agent, and this is no knock on parliament or on the media or on politics, but you're judged by how much enforcement you do. And so you're a good enforcer if you take lots of really big, dramatic, shiny enforcement actions. And that's not to say that we don't think that some of those might need to occur in the early days of enforcement on AIDA, but that's not our intent. Our intent was to actually have this person work studiously and closely with implementers and with the community to get to good regulations, which is why we've structured the AI and Data Commissioner's powers to be extraordinary. So either a criminal backstop in the most egregious cases where people are actually implementing high-risk AI systems with intent and knowledge that they're actually maliciously deploying them, or order-making power to be able to kind of act in those particular cases where, again, we see high risk in situ. And so I think from an enforcement perspective, I'd say, take us where we're coming from and ideally work with us to be able to get to good regulations so that we can continue ideally on a model that's not obsessed with enforcement, but actually looking at what good deployment and implementation looks like.
Thank you so much, Mark. From the federal budget to Bill C-27, ISED's role, interoperability, harmonization, and governance and enforcement. You've told us a lot, and so thank you again.